Welcome. My name is Catherine Sickink. I'm the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I will be your moderator for this panel. This panel on human rights and COVID challenges and good practices for effective recovery. We have four very experienced and knowledgeable panelists. Each will be speaking for about 9 to 10 minutes, which should give us plenty of time to be able to receive your questions and comments and respond to them. So just know that you can place your questions and comments in the chat and Q&A button that you have available to you, and that those questions will be coming to us so we can address them. And you can do that at any point during the presentation. You don't have to wait until the end. In fact, it's better if you do it when it occurs to you. And then after this session, we'll continue our conversation in the Continue the Conversation session that goes from 1:30 to 2. So please join us as well if you are free and would like to do that. So there are obviously many pressing issues about the pandemic, but this panel's task is to keep our focus on the issue of human rights and COVID-19 and the special challenges that we face on these human rights issues during the pandemic. And obviously, it's not just the human rights to health, which is the first one that comes to mind, but also rights to liberty, to freedom of movement, to education, to information, to food and shelter have all been at stake in this crisis. Okay. The COVID crisis also raises interesting questions for the human rights academic and practitioner about the complex relationship of rights and of responsibilities. Okay, and how we can balance these rights and responsibilities. Now, this balancing was foreseen in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which speaks to limiting rights to, quote, respect the rights and freedoms of others. Okay, and in fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights goes further, recognizes that each of us has duties to the community in order to help promote rights. Each of our speakers will be addressing a different aspect of human rights and COVID. And those four speakers are, and this is in the order they will present, and that's the same order as the program. The first will be Megan Fitzgerald. She is the Deputy Head of the Democratization Department at OSCE, the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, or ODIHR. Secondly, there's Albrecht Neubel. He's a senior fellow in the research division of the Geneva Center for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces, DCAF, I guess it's called. And the third speaker is Hidayat Hassan, the director of the Center for Women and Democracy, the policy advocacy and research organization focusing on developing democracy and development in West Africa. And finally, there's Michael Tanner. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, an institute, a public policy research organization based in Washington, D.C. And so, as you see, people are coming in from all different time zones here, and we're going to try to keep on time and turn to our first speaker, Megan Fitzgerald. Welcome.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to the American Society for International Law for the invitation and for designing a panel on this important topic. I'm delighted to speak on the impact of COVID and the related emergency measures and the impact that they have had on human rights in particular. This has been at the core of my work and the work of the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institution and Human Rights for sadly over a year now, since the start of the pandemic. ODIHR has a specific role in that it serves as a clearinghouse for information from the 57 participating states on their states of emergency and emergency measures. So this positioned us to look closely at what was being introduced, how it was being introduced, when, and what further impacts what was introduced had. We began by taking a look at how states were declaring states of emergency or other emergency measures. And a few key things we found were there was no consistency in how states imposed emergency measures, whether it be a declaration of a state of emergency or emergency measures introduced through executive decree or public health legislation. There was no consistency in this. This shows there is a lot to be done on an international level to get consensus on when states of emergency and importantly, derogations of fundamental freedoms are justified. There was also no correlation between whether a state declared a state of emergency and the severity of those emergency measures that were introduced. What there was across the board the introduction of measures through complex legislation and regulations, often through multiple different legislative acts that contradicted one another and were hard to find or not properly published at all. This led to a lot of legal uncertainty and the use of recommendations or public announcements that weren't grounded in legislation. ODIHR also found that legislation introduced at this time was poorly drafted, adopted with little or no public debate, and amended frequently in a short period of time. It likely goes without saying that when states introduced emergency measures, it is clear they did not sufficiently weigh the impact on the most vulnerable and marginalized. And measures have proven to have resulted in indirect discrimination and unequal treatment. Overall, where states were struggling to uphold their commitments to human rights and fundamental freedoms before the pandemic, this was only exacerbated by the pandemic, such as in Hungary or here in Poland, where I'm speaking to you from. But also we saw states all of a sudden in a position where they could not protect these rights. There were extreme cases in the OSCE region where countries like Serbia or North Macedonia, where they were in the process of having elections when the pandemic hit, and were therefore faced with dissolved parliaments and a drastic shift of the concentration of power to the executive, with virtually no means of checking this power. But overall, there's not a single OSCE country that did not struggle to find the balance of what is necessary and proportionate to protect public health and how to limit the duration of emergency measures. Our report is the first ODIHR report where we had examples from all participating states. This really underlines how much we need to look at what states can learn from each other and what we did well and what we struggled with. If we continue looking at lawmaking before the pandemic, ODIHR had noted a significant increase in legislation that was being pushed through using expedited procedures. This continued and naturally got worse during the pandemic. For emergency measures, this was arguably justified. But if we look at examples such as Poland, where election legislation was amended shortly after the start of the pandemic, where not only could public debate not be provided for, but neither could any form of consultations. And also parliamentarians themselves were not familiar with the new technology and how to participate in discussions. Also, we saw states take advantage of the pandemic to push through debates on topics that should have been reserved for when proper participation and debate could be ensured. Such issues as women's rights or freedom of expression, or they used the pandemic to introduce tightening of legislation on things such as freedom of assembly. Tightening in a way that exceeded what was necessary for the pandemic and to protect the health of the population. If we look at access to justice, the importance of the courts during states of emergency cannot and should not be underestimated, not only as a check of the executive power and to ensure the remedies for those wishing to appeal the application of emergency measures, but also for protecting the most vulnerable. Across the world, courts closed either partially or at first completely. Judicial systems were not prepared for moving to virtual formats. They had to triage cases, they had to extend deadlines and statutes of limitations. Many decisions had to be taken without clear, firm basis in law. And this potentially impacts the enforcement of such decisions. This jeopardized also the fair trial rights, particularly as courts turned to holding hearings online. Beyond the timeliness of trials and ensuring that those detained were brought promptly before a judge, with online hearings, courts struggled to guarantee the public nature of hearings. They also struggled to ensure that defendants have the facilities and are able to communicate confidentially with their lawyer, both while preparing for their case and during the hearings. The, the right to confront witnesses was also challenged. Needless to say, access to technology becomes an enabling factor here and is essential to being able to exercise your rights in a court case if it's being held online, as does the ability to use technology. We are all now more familiar with Zoom than we were before. One aspect I feel underlooked is the impact that the measures had on the functioning of civil society. We unfortunately did see some states make attempts to tighten legislation on regulating associations, but more universal is the impact that emergency measures had on how civil society worked. Essentially, civil society was generally not considered as essential workers. So their employees had similar restrictions to public sector workers, as in they were not allowed to go to work. So essential civil society wasn't able to conduct activities like monitoring places of detention or working with victims of trafficking. Also, civil society did not always have access to the economic support that businesses had. So many organizations were forced to downsize or close. This all impacted the role civil society should have had in developing good policies and disseminating information. To close, I would like to note the effectiveness of the responses to the pandemic has been determined above all by the level of the trust in society and the commitment of political leaders to learn, collaborate, and consult. On that last note, just as almost all human rights and fundamental freedoms have been impacted by the pandemic, so has the legislation that protects these rights. So as we emerge from the pandemic, hopefully soon, we will have a unique opportunity to revisit this legislation, improve it, and do so in not just for the future crises, but also so that they are more effective in ensuring and protecting these rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan Fitzgerald, for that fascinating presentation. And now we're going to our second speaker, Albrecht Schnabel.
All right, thanks, Catherine. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I will speak about security forces and security sectors' roles in and response to COVID-19 measures with a focus on effects on human rights. And here I draw on research that we have been doing on how security sectors around the world have responded to both the Ebola and COVID-19 crisis. We looked at both of those. So now security sector actors play numerous, constructive roles in responding to health crisis. There are many good, important practices around the world. So armed forces, that provide critical help. Military hospitals play important roles in research and vaccine development and relieve pressure on civilian hospitals when deployed. Militaries maintain logistical preparedness with vehicles, with aircraft, ships equipped to carry cargo and personnel prepared then for rapid deployment. They deliver materials to remote locations where local medical facilities may not have the resources to handle crisis. They then also airlift people in critical condition or materials out of an area. They erect makeshift medical facilities and provide emergency medical care. Our police services, they provide crowd control, maintain public order, help enforce quarantine measures, assist in ensuring individuals in home isolation or quarantine, and ensure that people follow social distance recommendations. Then there are border and immigration guards that control and monitor cross-border movement at airports, at harbors, at land borders. And intelligence services centralize and analyze data, assist in contact tracing, collaborate internationally to prevent cross-border disease transmission. And in some conflict areas, we're also working with security actors, government security forces work in cooperation with non-state armed groups to deliver health services in remote locations. So Security forces clearly provide important services in managing the COVID crisis, but in many countries, they were not well prepared and trained at the beginning of the pandemic, and they also overstepped their roles and then, as a consequence, violated people's rights. So, if we look at the police, for instance, excessive police violence was reported in many countries during the lockdown periods that were imposed by governments around the globe. Um, Security forces, they include both police and military, use punitive exercises and push back demonstrations against lockdown measures or breaches of curfews with rubber bullets and tear gas, and that also in all parts really of the world. There have been some extreme cases where police used sticks, where people were locked up in dog cages, and similar offenses. Then police clashes with demonstrators against coronavirus measures occurred all over the world, and again, in really in all parts. If we look at intelligence, so the use of surveillance technology by intelligence services, like use of robots and artificial intelligence, facial recognition, closed circuit television, or temperature scanners, they have actually been praised for its success in tracing and containing the virus in many places, like in Singapore and South Korea or in Taiwan. But there too has been a lot of criticism of the extent to which surveillance can infringe on civil liberties. Especially strict surveillance measures were put in place in China, for instance, and then plans to retain those measures after the pandemic sparked domestic controversy and also a lot of criticism from abroad. And so, for instance, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development then released guidelines for policymakers to ensure surveillance data governance is proportional, is transparent, is accountable, and is time limited. Now, so clearly, formal security actors can be very helpful in assisting public health services and local, regional, and national governments in responding to the crisis. But the interventions and assistance need to be proportional to the challenge, need to be time limited, and in close adherence to national legal frameworks, especially those protecting individual rights and freedoms. However,
I don't know what it is about this.
national and subnational emergency measures by the executive often extend the scope of duties for security actors. Or they consolidate power to allow fast-track decision-making. And that, of course, heightens then the risk of abuse of power. So to balance these risks, parliaments, independent oversight mechanisms, civil society, and the public pay close attention to the roles that are played by security forces to make sure that they do not overstep their constitutional and legal boundaries. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been many challenges to civilian leadership and civilian oversight across the world, and Megan already pointed out some of them. So in many parts of the world, there has been criticism of increased centralization of the executive and also militarization then during health crisis. And some examples are, for example, Latin America, Southeast Asia, where we work, regions that have long struggled with military juntas and military influence in government. So there have been, for example, laws exempting military and police from criminal responsibility that were passed in Peru. Or in Southeast Asia, quite prominently, sort of the Philippine president then repeatedly threatened military and police imposition of martial law. The efforts by democratic institutions and their oversight roles suffered setbacks in many countries. These efforts were sidelined by political leaders, ministries, and security institutions that insisted on moving quickly to respond to the evolving pandemic, quickly without being held up by lengthy debates or oversized processes. And so in general, what we learn also from the COVID-19 pandemic and the role of security sector actors, and especially the security forces, is that these experiences show us that independent oversight bodies, including human rights commissions, including police complaint bodies, intelligence oversight bodies, and defense ombuds institutions need to be strengthened. They play very important roles in providing complaint mechanisms for affected individuals and in exercising control then over security institutions. And with this, I want to close and hand back to Catherine. Thanks.
This is such a compliant panel. They're keeping perfectly to time. So congratulations to you. And now we're going to turn to our third panelist, Idayat Hassan. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, and I'll be speaking broadly about human rights, Nigeria, and the COVID-19. I'll chart this complex story while citing examples from other African nations where experiences actually converge. And the Nigerian experience with the coronavirus has been quite complicated. Early and commendable government efforts, such as the lockdown of the major cities by the end of March 2020, the closure of the international airport, and the massive awareness campaign were obviously overshadowed by massive human rights abuses and poor relief packages to citizens. So it's been a mixed bag, with the most effective parts of the government response spearheaded by the Nigerian Center for Disease Control, and the least effective part thrusting many into economic woes. Now, importantly, the exact number of the infections are quite unknown, and how many lives have been lost to the pandemic are unavailable due to underreporting, especially in rural and low-income communities. This is, of course, not unlinked with the poor public infrastructure for recording deaths in the country, as well as the stigma associated with the virus in many communities. In some circles, when loved one passed away with symptoms similar to COVID, the death is often termed mysterious as a result of old age, stress-related. And in fact, there is a state in the country where the governor outrightly denied the existence of the virus. And as such, the Kogi State Health Ministry recorded only 5 infections, the last of which was reported 9 months ago. Currently, people are getting vaccinated. This state has refused to collect a portion of the 4 million vaccine available, thereby jeopardizing citizens' outcome. Yes, despite the underestimated official figures, however, the country and many African countries have done remarkably well health-wise during this pandemic. So if you look at our death toll currently is at 2,036, which is just a bit 1% of confirmed cases since. But where there are these positive stories, the human rights violations, citizens' finances have actually suffered significantly. This lockdown throughout the continent were incredibly detrimental to the poor. Layoff everywhere, including in the civil society sector, not just corporate sector, and particularly the large number of citizens engaged in the informal sector, call it food vendors, hawkers, market traders, local entertainers, lost all their income completely in some cases. And in most of the country, even in Nigeria, there has been zero direct financial bailouts. There are no stimulus check, and even food or some of this stimulus material, when available, is also being affected by corruption in terms of who gets it. In fact, the unfortunate story in Nigeria is that of a stockpile of rotten food donated as COVID palliatives being found in warehouses already spoiled. Yet during the pandemic, especially during the lockdown, the poor masses starved. And this is even the reason why some do not believe in the COVID-19 virus itself. They say the hunger virus kills more than COVID when you look at the death rate. As the poverty capital of the world, any rise in economic difficulty in the country is a cause for alarm, actually. And one thing that has actually happened in this dimension is that many people have actually lost a lot. Economically, there has been a recession. So in Nigeria, oh, sorry, please. In Nigeria, there is now a 33.3% unemployment figure, the same as in South Africa itself. So many people are out of work. They are out of work. They are suffering, but there are no immediate palliative or responses in this dimension available to cushion this effect. But important, and food insecurity. Food security is the most affected actually in the continent. So they have no food for people to eat. Food inflation is actually high, and the insecurity has also affected farming, as well as some other government policies which bans importation of food. But importantly, there has actually been a spike in gender-based violence particularly during the lockdown. So during the March and April period in Nigeria, you have the shadow pandemic, reached up to oscillating between 149% and 223% increment in the numbers of women abused. And this is yet to change currently, as more women have lost their jobs, and they suffer from violence. They suffer violence from their intimate partners and family members, including young girls itself. The closure of schools for 7 months during the pandemic also exacerbated vulnerabilities of the already vulnerable, particularly school children in the rural area and the urban slums, as they have no access to technology. So while the rich continue classes online, these people have no access to technology, to laptops, facilities, and are not able to keep up in school. And importantly, it has also further increased the number of girls who are out of school and early marriage in a country where it's like the third most populous country, famed for early child marriage, actually. I think 44% of under 18 marriage happens in Nigeria itself. Now, when we take stock of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's led to climb down civil liberties, as well as, importantly, the right to protest. Several protests as recently as February 2023 in Lagos were clamped down on upon the allegation that they violate the COVID protocols. But at the same time, you see government officials having this bigger event with crowd, dancers at different places. In fact, the famous EndSARS protest, which was brutally cut down in October 2020, was also partly attributed to the violation of COVID guidelines itself. Beyond that, human rights violation is rife, as at the time that the COVID-19 has killed only 12 Nigeria between the months of March and April 2020, the security forces had killed 18 Nigerians at that point in time. And that is actually rife in most of African countries. Kenya, South Africa are examples of where those kind of things actually happened during the pandemic itself. Beyond that, there are also a lot of security forces violence against women and other actors for not wearing face masks, not just for converging, but actually for not wearing face masks. So while Africa has not suffered in terms of the numbers, it suffered a lot, especially when it comes to rights. In several of the African countries, we had authoritarian states took steps to consolidate their regime. So in Uganda, Guinea, Chad, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, people prevented opposition parties and civil society from holding rallies and organizing protests with the excuse of coronavirus. I think Chad is the most recent example where they climbed down after the president has finished his own rally, climbed down opposing parties who are contesting in these elections, these pre-elections, from campaigning under the guise of COVID-19. In Alpha Conde in Guinea, of course, was during that period able to quickly pass a constitutional amendment that allows him to cement his stay in office, and he has won the office currently for another 5 years. In Zambia, they had a radio station critical of the government, the prime radio shut down for not hearing COVID advertorials for free for the government, but instead asking to be paid for. These are several examples of what has actually transmitted on the continent. But importantly, moving forward, the state will have to build trust with its citizens. Because one thing the COVID-19 pandemic has actually revealed is the breakdown of trust between the citizens and the government in most instances. And that is why many do not even believe in this pandemic as real. Pass stimulus bill to also assist people, but ensure that it has a monitoring framework that works very well. Monitor and audit the activities of law enforcement agencies, whom we know often use excessive force in terms of doing their duties. Then invest more on addressing gender-based violence and commit to gender-focused cash transfer and prosecution of violators of SGBV, which is now like a living reality for us. And lastly, continue to educate citizens on the reality of the virus, how to prevent the spread, and the importance of taking the vaccine. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hidayat Hassan. And we'll turn to our last speaker, but not least speaker, Michael Tanner.
Mute button is always a problem. But thank you very much. And I very much appreciate you putting this panel together, and certainly an important topic. One thing we've already seen, as the previous speakers have said far more eloquently than I could, this really poses a challenge, trying to balance between the need to control a very deadly virus and protecting civil liberties. Certainly, I think people grant that there is a reasonable role for government in controlling the pandemic. I mean, historically, there's a long history of governments taking action here. In the United States, it goes back to the founding of the country. You can go back into the 18th century and see that in dealing with smallpox or yellow fever epidemics, procedures such as quarantines were fairly commonplace in the colonies. A process known as mandatory smoking took place in Boston, for example, where people had to walk through smoke-filled rooms because that was believed to kill some of the disease. And of course, famously, George Washington mandated that all members of the Continental Army be vaccinated against smallpox. So there's certainly a history here of government action.
Michael, I'm sorry, you've frozen. Your screen is frozen. Okay. So we are having temporary technical difficulties. I assume I'm not the only one for whom Michael's screen is frozen. We can't hear. Okay. So we're just going to temporarily, while we're waiting to address these technical difficulties, we're going to turn to a question that has already come from an anonymous attendee in the audience. And so we'll ask this question, and then we hope by the time we answer it that we'll get Michael back with us. Okay, the question is to Albrecht, and it says, could you name a few more countries as examples of police overreactions? So you gave the examples of the kinds of ways that police are overreacting, but not the places where this is happening.
Yeah, that's always a tricky issue then to name countries. But I mean, if you look at the Ebola crisis, for example, Liberia, Sierra Leone, in the COVID pandemic now, it's in India. We're seeing cases. Paraguay, Philippines, they're quite prominently with an outspoken president, who likes to make wild statements. But then also places like South Africa, Zimbabwe, our colleagues working on sub-Saharan Africa, pointing out, Kenya, Uganda, Senegal, Nigeria, Chile, Israel, Nepal, many European countries. When you look at the use of, for example, rubber bullets or so, that's sometimes underestimated. So in essence, a good number of countries that do that, where this happens. Certainly.
Thank you, Albert. I still don't see yet that Michael has rejoined us. So, Idayat, would you like to add anything to that question, since you also addressed the issue of police violence, and I wonder if you'd like to add any examples.
Thank you very much. I think we also experienced a lot of that in Nigeria. And like I referred to earlier, at a time where the COVID-19 virus itself had killed only 12 people, the police largely actually killed 18 people in less than 1 month. And they were only trying to enforce the lockdown measures, really. Most of these people were just walking around. It's the same also for not wearing masks, especially for people who are asthmatic, or even attempts to actually stifle the rights of women. There is a video that went viral in Nigeria where a woman had a sick child and she had actually gone out to get drugs for him, and she was physically brutalized just for being out during the pandemic. So we have a lot of examples, even in South Africa, in Kenya, in Kibera slum, which led to even more protests during this pandemic. And I think it has to do with the rules of engagement, which are not very clear, or the fact that the continent did not immediately know how to react to the pandemic, particularly with the infrastructural challenges it has, the poor health facilities. So they tend to be heavily handed to avoid a situation which, of course, we are now able to navigate, where people will be dead at every point in time. So it's the tension between law and order, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Hidayat Hassan. And Megan, I wanted to ask you a question. Actually, it didn't come from the audience, but it came when I was listening to your presentation. I wonder if you could share with us how many countries have declared emergency measures. You didn't say that. It seemed like quite a few. And how many countries have made derogation, and what kinds of derogations are most common?
Yeah. In terms of declaring emergency measures of some sort, all OSCE participating states did declare emergency measures of some sort. Out of that, only about a third of them were actually states of emergency, official states of emergency. Now, countries have different means of declaring a state of emergency. So sometimes it's not always called a state of emergency, but the emergency status that would entail derogations. So OSCE has 57 participating states, and about a third of that declared states of emergency. When they did so, not all of them announced their derogations. And so there's some issue with how states report their derogations or their intent to derogate. Of course, the most common derogations were to the freedom of movement, to the freedom of assembly, and some derogations on fair trial rights because of the issues that I explained in my comments.
Great. Thank you, welcome back. Michael, we decided to take some questions from while we were waiting for you to come, but now it's it's back. We turn it back to you.
Well, I'll try to sum up fairly quickly then. I don't want to take too much of people's question time. But what I want to say is that science.
You have your full time.
I just want to make the point that science can tell us what and things of that nature, but it can't make value judgments. The trade-off, for example, between we can tell us whether or not a shutdown reduces the spread of the disease, but it can't tell us the value of that, whether to spread the disease versus the economic activity that it costs is of more value. Those are individual judgments or political judgments or moral sentiments that science is ill-equipped to do. And I want to make the point that there's no corner solutions here in making these trade-offs. We have to recognize that it is always a trade-off. Some actions will allow the virus to spread more, and that will involve more people being hospitalized and injured or killed. And other choices will lower economic activity, cause mental health issues, cause other health issues, affect civil liberties. We're always trading off between the two. And that is really what we need to be focused on, is the trade-offs, not pretend that there's one right solution in every case that's going to have all the positive answers. So in doing that, I'd like to suggest a couple of criteria that we should bear in mind in making these trade-offs. Number one is process matters. Are we pursuing the decisions using the normal diplomatic norms here, or the normal democratic norms, or are we allowing our panic at the virus to stampede us into non-democratic processes? We've seen too often the executive branches overriding legislative branches or ignoring localities in their decision-making process and sort of issuing arbitrary decrees one way or the other, often without any legislative support for making those decisions. In the United States, we've had several states that have run into trouble because the executive authority to declare an emergency only lasts for a certain number of weeks, but governors have arbitrarily extended those length of time that those emergencies are in power, or extended or declared the emergencies with a legislature was still in session and they didn't necessarily have the executive authority to do so. These have often ended up in court and created a great deal of confusion. Secondly, the action that the government takes needs to be closely linked to the goal of dealing with the virus. So, for example, suspending the legislature because you have a pandemic is not a proper response to the pandemic. We just had actually the third court case in the United States that indicated that the Center for Disease Control did not have the power to arbitrarily end all evictions for housing in the United States, that they couldn't decree an eviction moratorium because there's no specific link between slowing the virus growth and people's housing problems. Now, those are a significant problem and need to be dealt with, but they should be dealt with through the legislative process, not through an agency decreeing this as a public health measure. Third, whatever action should be taken should be done in the least intrusive manner. And often we ran into this with the various lockdowns and shutdowns, that they seem to be across the board, regardless of the amount of risk that people are taking. Is a 25% reduction in capacity, or a 50% reduction in capacity, or 100% reduction in capacity? Which of those is the right answer, and do they apply in all circumstances? Do they apply equally to outdoor activities where there's relatively little risk, or to mass concert venues and things of that nature? People sort of have adopted across the board and simply done a light switch rather than sort of a fine tune where we tune up or tune down the intervention depending on what is necessary to control the disease. It's been we shut down and then we open up as the only two alternatives. Fourth, I think we need to look at the question of whether there's a disparate impact to the measures that are being proposed. This is both in terms of their impact. For example, the shutdowns have been more likely to cost jobs in communities of color in the United States or among low-income populations. It's been relatively easy for people like me to shift to home work, although the computer didn't necessarily work so well today. But still, I've been able to maintain my job, maintain my productivity, work from home. If you are in a job that involves, say, the hospitality industry, and it shuts down, that's not something you can simply pick up and move to your home office. So people in those industries are likely to be impacted more often, and we know that those tend to be lower income people. In fact, there's been, according to Census Bureau data in the United States, more than half of all people in the upper quarter of incomes have moved to home work since the pandemic broke out. But only about 1% of people in the bottom 20% of incomes have been able to do so. So we need to look at that. Look at what happens when schools shut down. The fact is that if you're wealthy or in a white neighborhood, you're much more likely to have the broadband and other materials necessary in order to be able to learn from home than if you are in a poor neighborhood or communities of color. So these things all need to be considered. And finally, I just want to point out one last thing is that we should be a little bit humble in determining what actions actually work and what ones don't, because it appears that private actions actually tend to mirror government actions with or without the mandates. That is, people tend to not go to crowded venues, regardless of whether or not you've imposed a 25% or 50% capacity mandate on that venue. The pandemic tends to force to make people act in certain ways. People were voluntarily adopting mask mandates even without the mask mandate. People were voluntarily wearing masks before they made them mandatory. And so we should be aware of whether we're doing that, and the fact that the government actions often then sort of mimic the public reaction. The public gets sick of the government actions if it goes on too long or seems too arbitrary or seems too restrictive. The public sort of rebels, and then you have enforcement problems that go in. And once again, we can look at the disparate impact of enforcement. In New York City, for example, when they looked at who was being stopped for violating the mask mandate, it turned out to almost always be people of color. This was sort of another pretextual stop for other law enforcement purposes. So those are all some things we need to bear in mind. I'm going to let people go to the question and answer session at this point, because I think other people covered much of what I was doing, but I did want to make a couple of those points.
Thank you so much, Michael Tanner. And we have two really good questions here. One from Kathleen Roberts and one from Sahir Muhammad Ali. And they're both kind of touching on similar issues, and they're really both made to the same to the whole panel. And so I thought I would read both those questions and then just go through the panel one more time and ask all of you to address them. And maybe I should start backwards and start with Michael, since you said some people said things that you were going to say. So now we'll give you the chance to start first. And these two questions are this first. Kathleen Roberts asks, what innovations have you seen to protect human rights, such as access to justice rights, even with COVID protocols? So here asking about how there have been innovations during the pandemic for protecting human rights. And then a related, but I think broader question that Sahar asks, can you give us any good examples of how public health measures were enacted that did not infringe on human rights? Okay. And so, Michael, would you want to get us started on that?
Sure. I think a lot of innovations have to do with the fact that there was greater recognition that COVID did not affect people on an equal basis across the country. The fact that communities of color were much more likely to suffer from COVID, both in terms of the number of cases, the number of hospitalizations, the number of deaths, and the economic fallout. The fact that there was that recognition was an important change in the dynamic. I think in past pandemics, past epidemics in the United States, people sort of ignored those impacts. And the fact that those were taken, and then we took direct action in terms, for example, of making vaccines more available in these areas, using the existing networks that exist in some of these areas in order to get the vaccines out on a more equitable basis. Those are important innovations. In terms of things the government that have worked well, I certainly think that obviously the bringing out the vaccine in record time is something that we should do. We should all take a certain amount of pride in, around the world. Both the production and the invention of these vaccines is certainly a terrific step forward. We've also seen government and public health things simply in terms of things like the fact that they recommended masks and recommended social distancing, recommended washing hands, basic hygiene issues. the fact that they brought these on, provided information purposes. Information is always good. And the governments have done or at least some governments have done a reasonably good job at getting that information out. And of course, that does not restrict public rights or civil rights in any way.
Thank you, Michael. Hidayat Hassan, do you have some examples of innovations that you may have seen in Nigeria or elsewhere in Africa, or good examples of practices that protected human rights, that protected people against the pandemic, but also did not infringe on human rights?
Oh, thank you very much. I think that in Nigeria, what became very obvious is state capacity and the tension of federalism, actually. And I'll use two states as an example here. Borno State is the state heavily impacted by Boko Haram, the Boko Haram insurgencies, the terrorists. But that was the first state to come up with a virtual court system. So immediately during the lockdown, they kept having the court cases. It was going on all the time. That was first of its kind, even before states like Lagos State could catch up with it. This was very good because it helps in the timely dispensation of cases online. So that's a positive in terms of access to justice. Then Lagos State is the second example where public education, public provisioning, again, was very successful. With the public education, even now that we've started the vaccination effort, you will find that within 3 days of vaccination in Lagos State, over 12,000 people had actually been vaccinated, compared to places like Abuja, which is the Federal Capital Territory. As at last Friday, we had only just 700 plus vaccinated, and there are actually vaccination available in most of those places. So public education, the provision of masks, free face mask, immediate response to oxygen, as in having oxygen tanks, and all these issues that actually affect public health, especially in a cheap way, really helped in alleviating the suffering of Lagosians compared to other parts of the country.
Thank you, Hidayat Hassan. Okay, we're going to turn next to, going backwards here, we're going to turn next to Albrecht Neubel. Can you give us some examples of successful innovations?
I mean, in terms of innovations, I guess when we look at, the security sector, security forces, when we started by trying to learn lessons from the Ebola epidemic, and we're quite frustrated that so little has been learned. In part also because the crisis was was localized in a way and didn't affect the rest of the world as much as the COVID pandemic did. But now there's been the lessons learning has been accelerated in part because also everybody is experiencing the result. I mean, for security sector responses, Taiwan, for example, is a good issue, and they have learned a lot of lessons from the kind of SARS crisis, where they put in place structures that allowed the country to respond quite quickly. But there are other issues beyond the security sector that have been mentioned already, and testing, for instance, vaccinations. A lot is being learned there right now. There's a lot of injustice probably and will be in the administration of vaccinations, provision to various countries around the world, and a lot will be learned along those lines. The same with little things like homeschooling, for instance, or employers' abilities to respond to the crisis and let people work from home and so on, and states to support those who have fallen out of jobs. And just one comment on the question on, if they're good examples, public health measures. Mostly, and if I look at also the role of the security forces, they are constructive and they're good and they're helpful. I mean, we kind of focused here a bit on the violations that take place, but that doesn't mean that, all security forces around the world are violating human rights simply by implementing these public health measures. And one thing that's sometimes forgotten is also that the security forces themselves are putting themselves into danger in quite a lot of cases they themselves are not protected well enough and have a lot to learn to keep their own people kind of safe and healthy. Thanks.
Thank you, Albrecht Neubel. And Megan Fitzgerald, please.
Thank you, Kevin. I guess I would touch on a few things. One, are there good examples of how public health measures are introduced with not infringing on human rights? I would even venture to say no, they're not. I mean, these measures, these emergency measures that were introduced, all infringed on human rights in some way or another. What was good, though, was when states practiced, made sure that they reviewed those measures on a regular basis, and that they made those judgment calls about whether or not they continued to be necessary and proportionate. And we did see states doing that as the pandemic progressed. We also saw courts step up and become more proactive in reviewing restrictions and reviewing the measures and decisions of the executive. From an innovation point of view, the technology, I feel, was largely there. What was not there, as I mentioned in my remarks, was the legal framework for using it in courts and parliaments. And I would caution against being too excited about the technology and access to justice, because we really do see that there's still a lot of concerns about using new technology and virtual settings for court hearings. Some good positive examples of things that we can draw from the pandemic are things like civil society adjusting their methodology and being able to continue monitoring places of detention and torture. We saw civil society also being able to monitor trials because they were aired publicly. They were streamed. Online assemblies is a growing field, and how states can protect the freedom of assembly online is growing, but we also saw an increased use of online assemblies. And one point we haven't mentioned is migration. Surely migrants were adversely affected by the pandemic and the measures, but in many states, the need to protect the health of the migrants resulted in them being regularized and being allowed to have the legal framework to access the public health services that they needed. And they also were changes to their places of detention, introducing more humane conditions. They had to, because otherwise the health of the migrants would be at risk. So those are a few examples.
Great, thank you, Megan. Now we have a final question from an anonymous attendee. I'm going to use it as a bridge because we're almost done with this session, but we are going to move to a session called to continue the conversation. So I'm going to give the question now. I'm going to give Michael just a stab at it because he won't be able to join our conversation later. He's got, actually he's off to get his vaccine. I'm sorry, I hope I'm not revealing personal information.
Perfectly all right.
And the question is, can the right to health not justify all enforcement measures infringing on civil liberties since death cannot be reversed?
Yeah, I know we like to say that protecting, saving one life is the most important thing, or saving lives is the most important thing, but we actually don't believe that, and we don't act on it in other circumstances. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people die every year in automobile accidents. If we really wanted to save lives more than anything else, we'd ban the car and trucks from the roads. We don't do that. We're not going to do that. The fact is that it's always a trade-off that we make, and we judge that other things are more important than a certain number of lives lost. Now, how to make that cost-benefit proposal is a very complex philosophical and economic question that people can debate for a long time. But the fact is that we are always going to value other things as much, and I think our civil liberties and human rights are things that we should place a high priority on.
Mm-hmm. So thank you very much, Michael. And I want to take this opportunity first to thank all the panelists for excellent presentations. But I also want to say, if you're interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say about that last question, well, that's a question we will begin or continue the conversation with, which we have to do by first ending this session and then moving to the continue the conversation session. So it's been a pleasure to moderate this excellent panel. And I encourage people to join us for the continue the conversation. Thank you very much.